Can you talk a little bit about the I Have a Dream speech? I know that you in the book you lay out how that wasn't even the main focus of the speech, that he had given that speech multiple times. There's always been that saying that Mahalia Jackson was telling him, say the dream, talk about the dream. Can you just talk about that moment, how it galvanized people and through writing that, like how were you what was your positioning on writing that moment and really giving it the space that people have always in its impact in American history?
Well, first of all, you're right that it was the "I Have a Dream" speech was improvised. I don't think it was Mahalia who encouraged it. I think Mahalia was just saying after he started, "That's right, tell him about the dream." And then some people made the leap to say that she encouraged him to launch into the "I Have a Dream" speech. I don't think so. The first half of the speech that he gave was written out, and it was most largely about economics, and it was very uh, radical in a way. He talked about police brutality. He talked about economic inequality. He hinted at the idea of reparations. So it was a pretty radical speech. And then when he got to the end of the printed remarks, he launched into the "I Have a Dream," and of course that was so powerful. And no, most Americans had never heard him preach that way before. Most white Americans had never heard a black preacher. Period. So it really moved people and really stirred them. And "I Have a Dream," of course, became the only thing people remembered. Um, to answer the second part of your question, for me as a writer, how do you tell that story? How do you describe the greatest speech of the 20th century? How do you capture the magic of that voice? Right? You can't, because no matter how I write it, you're not going to hear that beautiful voice, and you're not going to feel that rhythm. Um, you're not going to. So I decided to try to tell it sort of as a panorama. I told it through the story of three people: King, the white park ranger standing by his side, and this 20-year-old girl named Francine Yeager, who was in the crowd, who traveled from Chicago at the last minute with just a change of underwear and two bottles of Pepsi in her backpack, so that you could see how that speech is affecting and changing people's lives in that moment.
Yeah. And then from your doing your interviews, like how was that? Like getting all these people to get into the book. I know you talked about me talking with Dick Gregory, and he was one of the catalysts for the book, but and Harry Belafonte. Just talk a little bit about that experience, like getting all these different people to come along and getting there and getting to talk to them for this book.
Yeah, that was one of the great privileges of my life, to get to know people who knew Martin Luther King, and even for a couple of them to become my friends. To think that like a friend of Martin Luther King's could be a friend of mine is just, gives me goosebumps. Um, and I knew right away that this was something super special, that all these folks were in their 80s or 90s, and this might be the last chance to interview them for a book. And I really approached nervously, like, did they want me to do this book? Did they think that another King biography was important? Would they help me with it? Because, if I didn't have support of the people who knew King and the scholars in the field, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to do it. And the fact that they all felt like, not all, but like the vast majority said to me, we really need a new biography of Martin, or ML, as some of them called him, if they went way back, because they felt like that we as a society had lost sight of his humanity and turned him into this, you know, mythological figure, and they wanted to see the real man back, at least on the pages of a book. So it was a great thrill for me. I interviewed, more than 100 people who knew King, and I did most of them in person before COVID hit. So it was just one of the great thrills of my life.
I love to hear it. And how was I know it had to feel like a lot of pressure to write this book, speaking of like talking about the towering figure that is Martin Luther King. So talk to us about that. Like how did you feel a lot of pressure writing this book
Oh
or
my
how
God.
did you navigate that?
Insane amounts of pressure. I mean, I feel pressure on any book I write. Like, Lou Gehrig, who am I to tell Lou Gehrig's story? I never met him. His family didn't give me permission. Like, millions of fans look up to him. People with ALS look up to him. That's an enormous responsibility to take someone's life story in your hands. But with Martin Luther King, it's like multiple levels of more responsibility, because he's a saint to many people. I mean, people have his picture on the wall next to Jesus, in a lot of homes, right? So that's a lot of responsibility, and I was really nervous about whether I could do him justice. whether people would be receptive to hearing about some of his flaws, or whether there might be, a backlash for that. But I gained confidence, first of all, by, like I said earlier, asking for help from his friends and from other scholars in the field. And then from just digging and digging and finding new material and realizing that like I could contribute something to our understanding of King. I found, his father's unpublished memoirs. I found tapes that Coretta made um, when right after her husband died. I found files that King's secretary had kept, so that I could add to our understanding of him, and that just felt like a great privilege.
If you enjoyed that clip, make sure you head over to www.bookofapp.com to download our app so you can connect with your favorite bookish content creators, start conversations, and start your own book club.